There's an adage, a saying, a phrase that seems to ring true. I found it to be true. I would imagine each of you have also found it to be true. It is this: sex sells, right? Oh, okay. That's right. Sold a lot. Sex sells. It's the truth. If you want to get someone's attention, just make it a little sexy. That's all. That's what you need to do. That's all you need to do. And I'm looking out here, and I'm seeing people that represent different forms of work. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to think how could we just sexualize that a little bit to get more attention? You know, I'm just thinking through. I'm thinking through landscaping. You know what I'm saying? How can we sexy that up? That we already know for those firefighters here, you just put out a calendar. That's what you've done. You know what I'm saying? Did you make the calendar this year? No. Okay. Sign it, please. That'd be great. Yeah. No, but for real, that's it. That's what our culture, that's what our community says. Hey, if you're not getting the right attention, then you need to sexualize it somehow, and that will get more eyes attracted to kind of take a look at what you are putting out, what you are selling, what you are trying to get people to pay attention to. However, I will say this: there is something that sells even more than sex. It's fear. Fear. Now, this is not the thing that we want to talk about openly. We actually prefer to have a sex sales conversation, because if we actually start talking about the reality and the truth behind fear being a greater salesman, well, then we've got to make some admissions about what's happening and what we consume in our life. I mean, think about it. I could probably get you to empty out your entire bank account if I could scare you enough and convince you that if you didn't, your life would come to an end. Like, at some point, there's enough fear I can create for you. You're like, okay, that's it. I got no other choice, right? Because I don't want to die. I mean, we see it everywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter what news program you listen to. Fear. Fear. It overruns us. Fear is a feature of nearly all clinical mental health problems. It is a root cause of some of the most common ones. Fear. Now, when we talk about mental health, we always want to make sure we define it. Mental health is defined as our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Now, we leave that definition up there just for a second, right? Oh, sorry. Now it's back. We leave it up there just for a second, and now I want you to read it again and think about how fear impacts everything that's up there, right? Our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Fear is all throughout that entire definition. Fear. Now, when we think about mental health, we jump then to the issue that is with mental health, which is mental illness. Mental illnesses are among the most common health conditions in the United States. Mental illness is defined as this: a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, behavior, or mood. 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness each year. 1 in 5. That's an enormous number. It's an enormous number. I mentioned this last week. We'll have somewhere between 600 and 700 people on campus today. So do the math, 1 in 5. 1 in 20 U.S. adults experience serious mental illness each year. Serious mental illness is defined as one or more mental, behavioral, or emotional disorders resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. Serious mental illness includes major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and borderline personality disorder. So what causes mental illness? There's no single cause. There's a number of factors that contribute to the risk of mental illness. Adverse childhood experiences such as trauma, history of abuse, like child abuse, sexual assault, witnessing violence. experiences related to other ongoing chronic medical conditions, biological factors or chemical imbalances in the brain, the use of alcohol or drugs, having feelings of loneliness or isolation. All of those contribute or risk factors for mental illness. Now, I will say that when we say the word mental illness, that's a little difficult for us to hear. We don't enjoy that phrase. We don't like for someone to say, hey, I've got a mental illness. If I'm suffering from some depression, I don't want to be labeled with a mental illness. And so we changed it. We softened the language a little bit. And the common vernacular will be, well, I've got some mental health struggles, right? Because struggles seem temporary. Struggles don't seem to be defining us. Struggles are something I can just get past. It's just a mountain to climb. Once I get over the mountain, I'm past it, right? That's not who I am. That's what those things are. Where if I've got a mental illness, it's like, well, you're talking about me. You're not talking about the issue. And I can get past the issue. The issue's not me. And so we struggle with that. We struggle with the label. The truth is that we've got to figure out a way as a culture and as a society to lower the stigma for people to have open conversations about what they are struggling with. And just call a spade a spade. It is what it is. And we've got to create an environment where someone would be willing just to tell the truth about themselves. Instead of fearing that they're going to be labeled and then shunned or treated in some weird or strange way. Now, I'll be honest with you. There is an enormous group of people that pretend or assume that they have a mental illness or they struggle with fill in whatever blank. And the truth is they've just never faced any adversity and now they do and they don't know what to do. And there are people that just have no mental toughness. And the reason they have no mental toughness is because their parents solved everything for them or someone in their life solved everything for them. They never had to actually deal with the consequences of making bad decisions and actually following through on all the things that come with making a stupid decision. Someone saves them every time. Or someone never has had to want for anything. And so they don't even know what it means or feels like not to have something they want or desire. And there's a large group of people that just honestly do need to be told, just suck it up, just grow up. Like life isn't fair. Life isn't always going to be easy. Just get over it. Come on. However, while that is an enormous group of people, there is a much larger group of people that actually do suffer with mental illness. But as a culture, what we want to do is we like to paint with large, broad brushstrokes. Because the thing is, we should take the time to figure out the difference between the two and then pursue an action step with them based upon who they actually are and what they're actually struggling with. But that takes time and it takes an investment from us in order to make that doable. And a lot of times we don't want to take the time to figure out if someone really does need some help or just needs a good old kick in the pants. We'd rather just assume everybody needs a kick in the pants and just diagnose that and just move on with our lives. And as a community, we're failing on that end. That's not how we should do things. People do require more time. So the question becomes, when we have these questions, what does Jesus have to say about this? And we want to address biblical concepts regarding 4 major contributing factors to poor mental health. Week 1 was a false identity. Week 2, fear. The goal in this is not to say, hey, there's a solution by saying a prayer and reading a Bible verse. The hope is that every single person that listens or watches online realizes that Jesus is a catalyst towards mental health, that he's simply the first step of many steps that need to continue. That if you just read a Bible verse and you say a prayer, that all your problems and the things that you're dealing with haven't magically disappeared. That is not the way that God works in our lives. God has equipped people in our community and people in your world and your life to walk alongside of you through what really is life. And life sometimes. It just is what it is. And we need people to walk through that with us, step by step in that process. Jesus is just the catalyst for the beginning of a journey on a path that he sets for us. So when we think about fear, the very first thing that comes to mind is a moment in the life of Jesus that I want to walk you through this morning. Jesus has spent a couple of years investing in a small group of people. There's about 12 of them. And he's invested a lot in them. And that time is coming to a close. He knows it. They haven't really picked up on that it's coming to a close yet. but he knows it's coming to a close, and so he makes arrangements. There's 3 large festivals that happen for the Jewish people every year that are pilgrimage festivals. One of them is the Passover, and pilgrimage festival just means that they're all going to come to one place. So they're going to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an enormously significant city for the people of God. And so for the pilgrimage festival of Passover, everybody comes to the city, Jesus included in that. So Jesus and his crew, they go into the city and they are celebrating this feast, this festival of the Passover. The Passover in particular was meant to point their eyes and their hearts and their minds to a particular period in time for the Jewish people. At one point, they were enslaved by Egypt. And they were there for about 400 years enslaved by Egypt. And so the Passover celebrates the moment and the significant event that took place that freed them ultimately from their captivity. And so every year they get together and they remember this moment. And so Jesus was there, and there's a meal, there's a feast. This meal is a pretty long meal. It's something that doesn't happen just in like 25, 30 minutes. This is not a drive-through type meal. This is a long preparation type meal. It takes a lot of time. And they walk through it, and everything in the meal has some significance. Every single thing they eat or drink or consume, it has a significant thing that points them back to remembering their past in slavery. And so as they're sitting there taking part in this meal, this Passover meal, Jesus does something a little different. He takes some bread and he begins to break it, and he starts passing it out to guys. And he says, hey, this is my body broken for you. Whenever you eat this, from now on, I want you to remember me. Now, this is strange because Jesus is taking something that for sure already has some pretty good liturgy, tradition, some pretty standard things you say when you're doing this, and he's rewriting a script. He's taking something that's got about 1,500 years of history in this Passover meal, and he's rewriting it a bit and saying, hey, I know we've got some things attached to this, but I want you to remember me from now on when you eat this piece of bread. And then he takes this cup of wine and he pours it out and he begins to share it. And he says, hey, this is a covenant in my blood. And from now on, whenever you do this, I want you to remember me. Now, this is enormous for a group of Jewish guys that grew up in Jewish households, that this is a big deal. And all of a sudden, Jesus is like saying, hey, I know we remember this Passover thing, but I want to add to it. I want you to remember me. This is a big moment. This is an enormous moment. He follows this up with some more pretty enormous news. So he starts rewriting this tradition, which is just mind-blowing if you're a Jewish guy that's grown up going to this meal over and over again, that Jesus is changing it. That's just wow. But the second thing is Jesus actually tells them, hey, there's someone here with us that's actually going to betray me. And he's here in the room, right? And so he just drops that on them. He's with his closest friends. He's like, hey, one of you guys is going to betray me. And of course, they begin looking at themselves like, oh, it ain't going to be me. It must be you. I'm like, it ain't going to be me. It must be you. You know what I'm saying? Well, eventually, we come to find out it's a guy named Judas. And Judas had been there the whole time. Judas gets up and leaves, walks out. He's done, right? And everybody's just like, wow, this is nuts. This is crazy, you know? This is nuts. And then after that, so we've got bomb number one, right, is I'm going to rewrite what this whole meal is. Bomb number two, by the way, one of the guys has been so close to me, they're going to betray me. He exits stage left, right? He's gone. Here goes number three. This is what he says. He says, my children, this is Jesus talking, my children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. Now, this is another one. It's like, good Jesus, can we slow this down a little bit? You know what I'm saying? Like, we can only take one enormous thing at a time. You just changed 1,500 years of Passover history, and by breaking it and saying, remember me, you know what I'm saying? Like, what about Moses? Like, that whole thing. Like, give us time to let this settle. You didn't, and then you tell us that there's someone going to betray us, and now Judas is gone. Let that settle. And then it's, oh, and by the way, I'm about to have to leave. And my heart just can't take all this, Jesus. Like, good. Like, have you thought this through, you know? He says, same thing I told the Jews, I'll tell you now. Where I'm going, you cannot come. Verse 34. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Okay, so Jesus changes Passover, talks about Judas or betraying. Judas leaves. Then he says, hey, by the way, I'm not going to be here much longer. That's number 3. Then he says, oh, by the way, I want to give you a brand new commandment, right? Which is huge. He says, a new command I give to you. I want you to love everybody, love one another. As I've loved you, so you must love one another. Here's the most important, when we talk about depth of theology, the deep, this is rich, this next line. He says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Think about what he just said. He said, I want you to love each other the way I have loved you. In other words, now here's the thing. You do not get to define how you love one another. I've already defined it, Jesus said. Jesus looks at him and says, I want you to love everyone the way I loved you. Not the way that feels good to you, not the way that first comes naturally maybe, but I want you to love them the way I have loved you. So he defines that. And then he says, you can pull that off. Everyone else will know that you're actually my disciples. Can you think about how big that is? That is the way the world will know, because you're going to love each other the way I loved you. That's enormous. And then Peter's response to that is, where are you going? Where are you going? He's like a 4-year-old. He heard nothing else. Nothing else. Okay, that's great. Passover has changed 1,500 years of history. That's fine. You're not going to be here? Okay, that's fine. New commandment. Okay, the whole world. That's fine. That's fine. But you said I couldn't go somewhere, and I'm curious where that might be. Peter is the poster child for FOMO. He said, look, I've been following you around for 3 years. Where you go, I go, right? Like I've been there. Like I fell asleep a couple times when you told me not to, but I was still there. You know what I'm saying? Like I've been there, Jesus. So this whole he's having separation anxiety, this is not going well. Verse 37. Or Jesus responds, he says, hey, where I'm going, you can't go. You'll follow later. Verse 37, Peter asks, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. He says, let me just make sure that you are clear on this, Jesus. I know that you think you might be going someplace and it's dangerous, but here's the thing. I've already decided that I'm willing to give my life for you. I am devoted, dedicated, dependable, all the things. I am in. So there's nowhere you can go where I can't go, because I am willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice, which is my life for you. Peter's got this enormous amount of courage. Just blind courage. He doesn't know what he's getting himself into. He has no idea what he's waiting on, but he's like, I'm going. Have y'all recently seen on social media that there's these prank videos that are going around where a mom, my favorites are a mom, the dad will do it too every once in a while, the favorites are a mom, where a mom will come inside and the husband or boyfriend, something like filming the kids and their reaction. But the mom will walk in the door and she's like, hey, and they're like the little kids. They're like little kids, like 7 or 6 or 5 or 4 or 3. Enough to talk, but they're tiny kids. And so she'll walk in and she'll be like, hey, I was just outside, and the neighbor's mom was outside, and she said she wanted to fight me. And she's got 2 little kids that are y'all's age. Will y'all come help me fight them? Right? And so the kids are like, at first they don't know what to do. They're like, and all the videos that are great, all the good ones anyway, all the good ones, the kids are like, yeah, let's go. And they start clenching their fists and they're walking outside, right? And mom is dying. She's like, yeah, look at my squad. You know what I'm saying? I got a 3-year-old and 5-year-old about to whoop some tail. They have no idea. That's what's happening here with Peter. He has no idea what's outside the door, but he's like, I'm going. You're like, fists are clenched. Let's go. And Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Because very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. He looks at Peter and is like, you think you got some courage? No, we're not even going to make it to tomorrow morning. And 3 times out of fear, you're going to pretend like you don't have any connection to me. Just a little bit past that, this enormous group of soldiers and temple guards show up. Jesus had made his way to a garden. And so they had finished dinner. They had crossed into a place called the Kidron Valley, and there's a river that flows there. And they cross over the river, and they go up into a garden called Gethsemane. And they were spending some time there, and sure enough, they could see the torches and the lanterns piling out of the city, coming towards the garden, and there are hundreds of them. And they come to arrest Jesus, and so Jesus, he ends up, walks out and meets them, and one of the most incredible moments in the entirety of the life of Jesus happens right here. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You can go read it. It's just mind-blowing. When you read it, you'll probably glance over it, and you won't even see it. So read it twice, and you'll be like, hold on, what happened? And you read it again, and it's just mind-blowing. That's another message, though. Jesus ends up getting arrested. He gets arrested, and they start to haul him off to take him to trial. And he's actually going to go through a number of trials. It's going to start with a religious trial at a high priest, a little get-together. But they're going to do this multiple times before the sun comes up. They've already decided he's guilty. And so this is just a formality so they can kind of like just cover the rear end kind of thing. And so they start going through the motions. And so they take Jesus away. And we pick up in John 18. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The disciple who was known to the high priest came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. And so they get there, and they start to make their way in to see the trial. And evidently one of the disciples that was with Peter, following Jesus, kind of like, what are they doing with him? He had already had friends. Like, he was already connected with the high priest crew. And so when he got there, they're like, yeah, come on in, dude. And sure enough, he was walking, and at some point he realized, Peter, where's Peter? Freaking Peter. And so he had to go back. And he was telling the girl at the door, he was like, hey, he's with me, okay? I don't know what he's doing, but he should have been like holding onto my shirt tail. You know what kids these days, right? So okay. And so he gets him through, like he gets him in. And so he then walks in. And well, as he's walking in, this is what happens. She says, you aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. And he replied, I am not. Now, that was once. I don't know what happens in Peter's mind. He doesn't tell us. I don't know if in his mind, like, it was like, dun, 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 that's strike one. Like, but good news is, this one is not 3, and that's what Jesus said. So I'm a long ways from 3. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is just one time. Okay, so he was kind of right, but he ain't all right. You know what I'm saying? Just a little bit. We fast forward. Evidently, it's kind of cold. They had built a little fire in a barrel, and Peter was standing next to it. It says this, verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? And he denied it, saying, I am not. And one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. So to set the stage here, when they came to get Jesus, Jesus was willing to kind of surrender himself. Peter was not so much willing to surrender himself. In fact, Peter had a sword on him. One that I will admit that Jesus told him to buy at one point. He's like, go sell some stuff, you're probably gonna need a sword. Peter pulls it out like Peter Pan. And then he cuts this guy's ear off. He completely missed. I'm sure when you take a sword and you swipe it at someone, you're not aiming for the ear, but he missed, right? So he just didn't handle the sword. But he cuts the guy's ear off. And sure enough, like, it's a big deal. And then Jesus looks at Peter and is like, what are you doing? Like, put the sword away. That's not how we're gonna live our life. Like, what are you doing? Which I get was probably confusing to Peter. He's like, you told me to get the sword. And he goes, but that's a whole other message, right? He said, put it away. What are you doing? And so he puts it away. And now, obviously, word has gotten around. I don't know if the guy who got his ear cut off got on Instagram and was like, hey, this is what Peter did. And right? And so now people know. But somehow, it's been a few hours, and sure enough, there's one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man who Peter had cut, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, can you imagine? So there was fear that existed in Peter that caused him to deny Jesus. Because he was afraid. He didn't want what would happen if he associated himself with Jesus. So there was fear that did that. Can you imagine, though, the amount of fear and the fear level that increased when he heard the rooster crow? Like, he's already here, fearful for his life if he gets connected to Jesus. It goes to another level when he realizes that the Son of God told him just a few hours ago, 3 times. You think you got courage? 3 times. Before the sun comes up, you're going to pretend you don't know me. Jesus is convicted. Eventually, he ends that morning with a sentence of death. They sentenced him to be crucified. And it didn't take long for them to go through that process. So it's the same day. They put Jesus on a cross. He's there for a number of hours. And eventually, he dies on the cross. Not just passes out from pain, but is clinically, medically dead. He doesn't breathe. He has no brain function. He's dead and done. They pierce his side just to double check, and blood and water pour out of his side, spills onto the ground. He's done. And so they remove him from the cross, and there is a really wealthy guy that admired Jesus, and he said, hey, he can use my tomb. Let's put him in my tomb. And so they take him and they put him in the tomb. And there was a rumor that his followers were going to try some kind of little like prank hoax thing where they were going to steal the body and tell everybody that he had resurrected from the dead. And so the Jewish officials, they took care of that because they went to Rome and they convinced Rome of this. And so Rome put a little section of guards in front of the tomb, and then they sealed the tomb. So they put the rock in front of it and they put a seal around it, right? And so there's no way that anybody was getting in. The thing is, with resurrection and the plan of Jesus, there was no need for anyone to get in. The thing was, he was coming out. And so they did all the things on the outside to keep someone from going in, but they did nothing to actually make sure the dead person that can't do anything would not resurrect from the dead, because that's the way it works. And so that's what he did. And so the very feet that he had pierced and was nailed to the cross are the feet that he walked out on. And so the stone rolls away and he walks out on those 2 physical feet, breathing and functioning and hearing and listening and can touch and can taste and can smell, all the things. It's a physical resurrection. Jesus then proceeds to appear to about 500 people post-crucifixion, post-now resurrection. And he starts spending time with these people, and one of those moments is recorded by John. The boys, or at least a number of the boys that were really good friends with his, were really great fishermen. They were fishermen by trade, and so their parents were fishermen. It had been a part of their family business, and so they're in this place where they don't know what to do next. Jesus has been crucified, he's resurrected, but there's like, well, what are we doing? And they go fishing. And so they're out in the boat and they're fishing, and Jesus shows up on the shore close to where the boat is, and he yells out at them over on the lake. He yells at them. He's like, hey, have you caught any fish? And they're like, no, we hadn't caught any fish. How many of you been there? You know what I'm saying? Like, I caught a thing, right? So he's like, no, we ain't caught a fish. But here's the thing, Jesus too far, they don't know that it's Jesus. They just see some guy standing on the shore asking them if they've caught any fish. And I'm sure in their minds as fishermen, like, why does this guy care? They always ask when we've caught nothing. Nobody asks when we've caught everything, right? Nobody cares. But we've caught nothing. Everybody's like, did you catch anything? Did you catch anything? You know? And so they're like, no, we didn't catch anything. And so then the guy proceeds to give him advice. He's like, hey, it's because you threw the net on the wrong side. Throw it on the other side. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if y'all know this or not, but the bottom of the boat is the bottom of the boat. And it doesn't matter if you go on the left side or the right side. The bottom of the boat's still the bottom of the boat. It's not left bottom, right bottom. It's the bottom of the boat. So for them, they're like, oh, good gracious. If the way they fish is with nets, like if there was fish, they'd be, because the net was under the bottom of the boat. Okay, fine, we'll throw it on the other side. So they throw it on the other side, and all of a sudden, sure enough, there's fish before. Or there's fish are pulling up. Now, one of them is like, I've seen this before. You got to read that story another time. And so they immediately yelled out, they said, that's Jesus. And Peter looks up, because he was concentrating on fishing, and look at all these fish. And all of a sudden, one of the other disciples says, that's Jesus. And he looks up, and he's like, that's Jesus? Peter evidently had taken his clothes off, because the Bible tells us he has to put his clothes back on, and then he jumps in the water, which seems backwards. It's like, Peter, no, that's the jump in. But he put his clothes back on, and then he jumps in the water and swims to shore. Now, the Bible also tells us that the other guys in the boat still had to be fishermen and like get all the fish in the boat and then row themselves to shore. Like they were being responsible. Peter was just like, let me get to Jesus, you know what I'm saying? And so sure enough, he gets there, and he walks up, and Jesus has a fire and some bread and some fish, and he's just doing like this Sandals Resort beach thing where he's having dinner right there. So the guys come in, they bring it in, like they bring in the boat, and it's on shore, and they're all sitting there, and they're eating. And it says this in John 21:15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, well, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, right? So Simon is Peter, Simon Peter. Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, well, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, well, feed my sheep. 3 times, Peter denies out of fear. 3 times, Peter declares his devotion. But let's just think about how far Peter's come. And he's not even to a finished place yet. He hasn't even got to the finished place, which is just a couple more weeks away, where the Holy Spirit becomes a part of this whole thing. But Peter's going through this transformation. And just a couple scenes back, Peter is looking at Jesus, and he's like, hey, I will die for you. Where are you going? Because I want to go. I can go anywhere you can go because I'm willing to die for you, right? And Jesus is like, no, you can't. He's like, yes, I can. You don't know. I can. To this, where the third time he asked him, he's like, why do you keep asking questions you already know the answer to? That's what he says. He says, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him for the third time, do you love me? And he said, this is what Peter said, Lord, you know all things. He says, you know everything. You already know that I love you, which is so different from just a little ways back where he was like, Jesus, you don't know me. You don't know my courage. You don't know me. I will follow you anywhere. And he's like, actually, I do. You don't have the courage you think you do. 3 times before sunrise, right? To this, a complete place of submission is like, Jesus, you know everything. 3 times, though, Jesus gives him a next step to live out what he claims to believe. You love me? You know I love you, okay? Feed my sheep. You love me? You know I love you. Take care of my lambs. Do you love me? You know I love you. Feed my sheep. It's almost like it's not that Jesus wanted to give Peter 3 times to make sure he was answering the question correctly. Because Peter's right. Jesus knew Peter was answering the question accurately, correctly, the first time he asked. No, the significance is in the next step Jesus gives Peter. Jesus doesn't need to hear the answer 3 times. Truth is, Peter doesn't need to say it 3 times. The truth is, Peter needs to hear his next step 3 times. And next step is significant because of what Jesus says next. He says, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." You see, Jesus already knew the answer. Jesus actually already knew the outcome. Jesus knew that Peter would actually end up losing his life the same way Jesus lost his, on a cross. Now, Peter decides, or at least the tradition of the church is Peter decides that he can't hang on a cross the way Jesus did, and so he asks to be crucified upside down. But either way, someone else stretched out his hands and dressed him on that day in a way that he did not want to go. But that's what he was called to. A conversation birthed out of fear simply ends with another opportunity for fear. In other words, fear isn't going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. We will not live in a world where fear is not present. So what do? If fear is the root cause of almost every single mental illness that we experience, wouldn't the solution be to get rid of fear? But you can't get rid of fear. Well, how did Jesus lead Peter in the midst of his fear? How did he lead him? You see, Jesus knew that Peter was afraid at what we know today now as the Last Supper or the Lord's Supper. He knew that he was afraid that night, even though he had this blind courage. "I'll follow you anywhere." Jesus knew, man, you're so afraid. In fact, you're going to give an opportunity to show that you have that courage, and you're going to fail 3 times because you're so afraid. And you fast forward, and Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" He's like, "Yes, I love you." "You love me?" "Yeah, I love you." But every single time, Peter's like, "You know what? Loving me or saying you love me, that's not really the secret. I want you to do something about it. I want you to feed my sheep. I want you to care for my sheep. I want you to feed my lambs. I want you to tend to my sheep." In other words, Jesus says, I don't have a solution for your fear, right? I don't have a way to get rid of your fear or to dial it down a little bit or to make it disappear. I can't do that. Like, the fear is just going to be there. But what Jesus can do for Peter, and what I believe he does for all of us, is that he gave him a calling. He gave him a calling. In other words, I would challenge you this morning that the way we overcome your fear is with your calling. And you overcome fear with your calling. Now, I know, it's like, oh gosh, we waited 35 minutes to get to overcome fear with your calling. Yes. Let me explain it for a second, right? Let me explain it just for a second. Calling is one of those things that once you figure it out, it makes everything just begin to pale a bit. And there's this vibrant thing that's in front of you And that you are drawn to it, you're pulled to it, you're compelled to move to it. And so there's all these other things, these other circumstances, these other moments, these other hiccups, these hurdles that come into it. But no matter what those things are, you can't keep your eyes off this thing that you've been called to. And you just know, because it's almost like there was something more than yourself that created this in you, where you just are resolute, like it doesn't matter what the world throws at me, I am still headed in this direction. That's what a calling is. Now, we could come up with callings for ourselves. We've all done it. When I was a little boy, I wanted to be a professional baseball player. And I told people, that's what I'm going to do. And I think every adult I ever talked to was like, and I bet you'll do it. I remember my 6th grade teacher, she made me promise to give her front row seats whenever my team went to Wrigley Field, because she was from Chicago. And she just made me a promise. She's like, look, one day when you're a professional baseball player, you're going to give me front row seats. And I was like, yeah, Miss Kroll, no doubt I'm going to give you them front row seats. You know what I'm saying? I wasn't called to do that. I just thought it was great. It was shiny and cool, and I loved it. But I wasn't called to do that. If you'd asked me when I was 21, I would have told you, I am called to be president of the United States. You know? I would, 2024, I'm telling you, the time is coming. I would have told everybody, look, 2024, when you find me at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I'll give you a Christmas card. You come to the party. It's going to be great. That wasn't a calling. That was just an ambition. That was just an ambition. And those things, when things get difficult and tough, man, they fade away. I don't have the energy or the passion or the drive like I thought I did, but that's not what gets me up in the morning. That's not what gets me going. That's not what allows me to persevere or to push through or any of those things. Those things aren't strong enough for me. They might be strong enough for some folks, but they're not strong enough for me, right? Like, that's not me. That's not who I was supposed to be. But I will tell you, when it comes to my calling, I've wrestled with fear. In fact, the whole reason that Foundation took so long to get started was out of my own insecurity and fear, where I had to confess to a friend of mine, like, hey, I know what I've been called to do, but I will not do it. Like, I can't do it. It's been months, and I just can't do it because I was so set. I was so set. I've been in a great established church, and they had a long-term plan. And the money was so much better than Newnan money. Like, it was a lot more. It was so much more. And so I just had to say, this is the reason I haven't done anything. I don't have enough faith that God's going to provide for me financially, for my family. And I had to say it out loud. I had to just say, hey, I've got a faith issue. I've got a fear issue. I am scared to death. But I tell you, and there's always a tension between church and money. When you ask people who are disconnected from faith, hey, what's one of the biggest reasons you want to continue to be disconnected from faith? They will always, almost all of them will say, if you give them enough time, because the church only wants my money, right? That's it. That's the only church is concerned about. They're just concerned if I'm there to get my money. That's the only thing they care about, right? And so I live with that tension as a pastor. Our staff lives with that tension because we've made decisions that cost money, right? For sure, having a permanent location costs more than renting something for a couple hours once a week, right? It does. We have a staff, and for sure, we could do church and have 0 staff. I could go work somewhere else and just spend enough time just to do a Sunday morning Bible study. Like, we could do that, and it would cost hardly nothing, right? We can gather outside on sunny days, which is like 40 of those in Georgia a year. And the other ones we just wouldn't gather but we could do that. Right? No, like hardly no investment, no money. Like, that's a doable thing. But we made decisions that then require for us to have some funds, We commit to things in our community to help solve needs, and those cost money. For sure, we can stop doing all those things and just say, look, our financial, let's just decrease it 100%. Let's just get rid of the financial thing. I live in that tension. But this is the difference. Every morning when I wake up, I don't actually worry about our money situation. The only thing I have to concern myself with is being a yes man for God. That when he says, Clint, this is what I want you to do, my response ought to be, yes, sir. And that's it. And so if he calls me to do something, it's his problem how to fund it, right? That's not my problem anymore. My problem is just to say yes, sir. And it might mean that he doesn't fund it the way I thought he was going to, or he might not fund it as fully as I thought he was going to, or he might teach me how to do something completely different than anyone had ever thought of because the easiest way is to fund it. I don't know. But the truth is, as long as the calling is clear in front of me, the details, honestly, they will figure themselves out as long as I have focused on my calling. Now, here's the thing. Calling isn't just about planting churches. Every single one of you has one. And it might not be to plant a church, but it also might not be what you're doing now. And you might even be successful at what you're doing now. But here's the question. Is your soul satisfied in what you do now? Those are two completely different things. And I will tell you this, the success you will trade for soul satisfaction doesn't even compare. A calling. That's what you got to chase. So the truth is that calling breeds courage. It breeds courage. Now, whenever we make such a statement, overcome your fear with your calling, I think we've always got to get practical. And so let's get practical. How do you find your calling? Truth is, fear is always food. It either feeds your anxiety or it'll feed your courage. One of the two. And so how do we find the calling that allows our courage to eat our fear for breakfast? The good news is that Jesus told Peter how to find his calling. You probably missed it because there were so many other things going on. But he says it. After all that huge conversation, do you love me? Yes. Feed my sheep. Do you love me? 3 times, back and forth. All those things. He finishes the conversation with this. 2 words. Then he said to him, follow me. Follow me. In other words, our true calling is always connected to following Jesus. Always. And so if you're sitting here saying, I don't know how to find my true calling, let me tell you, start to follow Jesus more and better. If you can't figure out what the single clear call in your life is, that the question is not what is it supposed to be? The question is, hey, how do I put myself in a position to discover it? The way you put yourself in a position to discover it is to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus, because Jesus is never going to waste a willing soul who wants to wake up in the morning and say, yes, sir. What's next, sir? Yes, sir. I might have some questions sometimes. I might even be a little angry. I might even disagree. But at the end of the day, I want to get myself to a yes, sir. He's not going to waste someone who's willing. But that's what you've got to ask. So when you don't have a calling and you can't figure it out, the first question needs to be, where am I failing at following Jesus? And let me fix that, because there's a good possibility that the cloudiness and all the baggage that comes from that being broken has hazed up what God has called me to. And if I can clear that up, maybe the skies part a little bit, maybe some sun starts shining through, and suddenly clearly I can see what may have been there the whole time. I just discounted it because it looked a little foggy in that direction. Our true calling is always connected to following Jesus. And anytime we try and figure it out without him, we might find something that makes us happy for a season or 2 seasons or 10 seasons, but it will still always leave our soul unsatisfied. And don't be surprised if fear comes knocking at the door and you are worried about everything other than what you're called to, because you're so scared that some circumstance will rip from you what you hold so dear. But the truth is that we've been called to something by God. Nothing can take it from you, because he's still the one holding it, and no one's a big a boy enough to take it from him. Calling. He makes it sound so simple. Peter, follow me. I tell you what's crazy is this is one of the last personal conversations Jesus has with Peter. And the first conversation he has the same two words. Follow me. 3 years later, they've gone through everything you can imagine. And Jesus is still teaching them the same thing. It's really simple, Peter. I told you on day one, follow me. And if we make it